Hi, this is Manilin Boko, and I'm going to talk about the Canada Indigenous Peoples. The content of my presentation is the overview of Indigenous peoples in Canada, the history, the impact of colonization, Government of Canada relationship with Indigenous peoples, importance of teaching the North, summary and references. An overview of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So there are three groups of Indigenous peoples in Canada. They are the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. Inuit live in the northern region of Canada and Inuit Nunavut as their homeland, while Métis, a combination of European and the indigenous descent, mostly live in the provinces of Prairie and Ontario. And First Nations are the original dweller of Canada living in the South of Arctic areas. So 5% of Canadian population are indigenous according to the Statistic of Canada year 2021. And indigenous peoples are protected by Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982. This is all about the reconciliation to the indigenous peoples. History. The indigenous peoples are the first people in Canada. Complex social, political, economic, and cultural systems already exist even before Europeans came. With foreign settlements, traditional living were affected. Colonial practices and policies was introduced to indigenous peoples, and because of that, it impacts the indigenous people. What are the impact of colonization? The Indian Act. It when this when this is created, it suppressed the indigenous living in many aspects, like the language, their religion, the culture, and even their right to vote, and the residential schools. Because of this setup, students grew up away from their family, so they are not able to familiarize the indigenous way of living or like their culture and experiences. They are also not able to practice the following: to speak their native language, the indigenous spirituality, wearing their traditional costumes, and potlatches and other traditional ceremonies. And they cannot also use their traditional names. Their names were changed to European names. This picture here is the potlatch, one of the traditional ceremonies. The Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. It says that all relations with Indigenous peoples need to be based on the recognition and implementation of their right to self-determination, including the inherent right of self-government. 2. Reconciliation is a fundamental purpose of Section 35 of the Constitutional Act 1982. The honor of the Crown guides the conduct of the Crown in all of its dealings with Indigenous peoples. 4. Indigenous self-government is part of Canada's evolving system of cooperative federalism and distinct orders of government. 5. Treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements between Indigenous peoples and the Crown have been and are intended to be acts of reconciliation based on mutual recognition and respect. Six, meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples aims to secure their free, prior, and informed consent, and Canada proposes to take actions which impact them and the rights of their lands, territories, and resources. Seven, respecting and implementing rights is essential, and any infringement of Section 35 rights must by law meet a high threshold of justification which includes indigenous perspectives and satisfies the Crown's fiduciary obligations. 8. Reconciliation and self-government require a renewed fiscal relationship developed in collaboration with indigenous nations that promotes a mutually supportive climate for economic partnership and resource development. 9. Reconciliation is an ongoing process that occurs in the context of evolving indigenous crown relationships. 10. A distinction based approach is needed to ensure that unique rights, interests, and circumstances of the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and Inuit are acknowledged. Why it is important to teach the North to college studies, personal, and professional context. To college studies, it is important to create awareness among students about life in the North. In the article of Christensen 2013, she mentioned that their pen pals from Toronto during primary school they ask surprising questions about the North because they don't know they know just a little about the North. So they ask that surprising questions like if they live in igloos or if they travel in by dog team. So it is important that students are taught about the indigenous peoples to while studying to avoid stereotypes. Well, in personal, to be able to understand the significant role of indigenous peoples in shaping the modern North and the rough experiences of their ancestors. And Parrot Z 2023 discussed that the implementation of the Indian Act, the residential school mixed with the act of racism and segregation have a huge negative outcome to the health ways of life and socioeconomic well-being of indigenous peoples. So also this is also applicable not only to the indigenous peoples but also to other people, especially that we are living in a multicultural society. Well, professionally, as Christensen 2013 said on page 13 of her article, growing up as an indigenous person in a northern city like Yellowknife is not the same as growing up being in the same city. So it is important that we understand people and we put ourselves to their shoes. Me as a healthcare worker, so I must learn my clients about them and their needs and I should avoid bias and racism. So it is the same concept with the Canada relations to Indigenous people. In general, it is important that I respect all my clients and treat them with fairness despite the race, culture, and beliefs. So, in summary, the indigenous peoples and their history are vital parts of the existence of country of Canada. As a student, a person, and a professional, it is important to know the North and the natural settlers and treat them with empathy, respect, and without stereotypes. That's all. Thank you. And these are my references.